Good morning and good evening, no matter where in the world you are. Pleasure to have you join us for this webinar. I hope your second quarter is off to a good start. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Cliff Kalb, president of C. Kalb and Associates. Had the pleasure of meeting Cliff years ago when he was head of his strategic business analysis at Merck, leading their global intelligence function. His sustained track record of innovative successes in marketing, strategic planning, business intelligence and analysis, market research, and health policy in multiple companies speaks for itself. Active across the industry, he served as past president of both SKIP and PBIRG and chair of the Conference Board Council on Competitive Analysis. Cliff is a 2004 CI Fellow and also chaired the fellowship. He's one of the few fellows to ever be recognized with the 2013 SKIP Meritorious Award and in 2014 as a recipient of the Fay Brill Distinguished Service Award. It's my extreme pleasure to have you join us, Cliff, and to go through this part two of setting up a CI function. Looking forward to hearing your wisdom. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you much, Craig, for that very kind introduction, and thank everyone who has joined us on this call. I'm going to start by mentioning the fact that we had done part one about 2 months ago. So for those that weren't able to attend that, I'm going to go quickly over some of the highlights of that one before I move on to the new material. And if you have questions, this is going to become available afterwards, and you can, as it's being recorded. So we'll start with a view of the steps that are necessary to put together a CI function, and there are 4. The first one is to establish a mission. And to make it clear, I thought the best way to cover it quickly would be to read you the vision statement of the person who started the intelligence function at Merck, where I worked, to give you an idea of how a vision statement from a CEO can be converted to a mission statement for a CI group. This is from Henry Lebmanowitz, the president of Merck & Company. Business intelligence is the industrial equivalent of military intelligence, as military commanders are dependent on a constant flow of relevant and understandable intelligence to plot strategies and tactics. So too do captains of industry need adequate intelligence to achieve their commercial goals. In both cases, knowledge is not only an instrument of power, it is essential insurance against disaster, unquote. Now, if that is not a clear vision statement, I don't know what is. We could take that and morph it into our mission statement, which carries the strength of his office and his interest. And it turned out that he became our number 1 champion in the company. Once that's done, you move on to the second step, which is identifying the organization's key intelligence topics. This involves surveying the initial client group. Those will be identified for you by the person at the highest level who wants to know where the intelligence is going to come from and who's going to be those that need it the most. The third step becomes designing the intelligence function and all of the details that involve putting it together in terms of the way you're going to operate. That includes how communication will happen, how confidentiality is used, what kind of deliverables are provided, how archiving occurs, what resources are purchased, staff issues, and probably the most important one, which overrides all of them, is how the intelligence function will fit and align with the corporate culture of the firm that you work for. And finally, the last step is to select the appropriate organizational model. Now, over the years of the work that I've done, along with my colleague Jan Herring, who I worked with to prepare this material, it turns out that we came across about 8 different possible models, going from the smallest up to the largest kind of company. We're going to cover them all today, and all of them are tested and employed in various firms for which consulting was done or at places where we actually worked ourselves. Next slide, please. Can we turn to the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, the keys to a successful program, I just want to go over this again to make sure it's clear. The program will serve the entire management team, but their expectations, which are laid out first, is what defines the mission. And usually that will come from the champion if it's somebody at the highest level. So what you have is champion number 1, and over the course of time, you're going to need to develop champions number 2 and number 3 so that you have strong support from the client group that you're going to serve. It has to become a studied approach, one step at a time, something that happens over a series of interviews. That's what happens in the second step. You'll be interviewing all of these people that are your clients. Usually the right time to do that is when objectives for a planning cycle have been agreed upon and the person knows what's going to be due for them, let's say at the end of the first quarter, the second quarter, the third quarter, etc., and what kind of intelligence support is going to be necessary to have him achieve those goals. That allows you to do the planning of the intelligence actions that you have to take to support them. Then you move on to the appropriate intelligence system design. And again, it's the one that fits the culture. That's how you select what I'm going to call the right organizational model, which I'll be covering in a little bit later. And finally, the last thing that you'll see, if you look carefully at each one of the models that I will describe, what you have to do in the first year, if you're starting an intelligence function from scratch, is establish the 3 basic intelligence operations. Number 1, information services. Number 2, a collection capability for primary collection work. Number 3, the analytical capability and the ability to deliver results in a format in which your clients would like to accept them. So it is a planned process. It takes time, but if you do it the right way, you'll have much more success and a much more longevity in the role. Next one, please. The Corporate Intelligence Department mission that we developed out of the one I showed you is listed here. Providing the CEO and senior management with timely and appropriate intelligence upon which to make sound business decisions, develop effective strategies, and act with foresight and now we say how we're going to do that, monitoring the competitive environment, gathering and analyzing information, and forecasting future developments and how they apply actions on the part of the company. And this is one way of sort of stating your mission statement. There are many other ways to do it. And this one is a little bit longer than most people take, but this was the one that we chose. Let's move on. I just want to take a moment to talk about the concept of kits. For those of you that are familiar with them, this will not be new news. One thing that may be new is where the concept came from. This was something that Jan Herring himself did when he moved from working in government intelligence into private intelligence. In government intelligence, they called their topics or the work that they did NITS, N-I-T-S. That stood for National Intelligence Topics. When he moved over to the private side and started to work for Motorola, which is the company where he started his intelligence career in private business, he substituted a K for the N, and that became Key Intelligence Topics, which is now replete throughout the intelligence literature as a way of intelligence professionals defining the tasks that they have to deal with as communicated by their managers. Their managers won't call them kits. They'll call them business issues. The intelligence folks call them key intelligence topics. And then below that, key intelligence questions that support the topics, which gives you an outline for how to conduct your work. There are several types of kits: early warning, strategic and operational decisions, and knowing the competition. In each one of those, the type of intelligence work that you're going to do will be different, and the skills that you will have to develop will be different. The one thing that will be the same is something I like to call the 4Ds. The first one is define, the second one is decision, the third one is develop, and the fourth one is deliver. So in every one of these cases, whether you're looking for a decision, whether you're looking for a warning of something that's going to happen in the future or likely to happen in the future, or whether it has to do with just outmaneuvering a particular competitor in the marketplace, you need to define the task. You need to find out if there's going to be a decision that has to be made and what is the timeline associated with that. You have to develop the work by conducting research, and you have to deliver it in a format that the customer will like to receive it in. And that can vary. It can be oral presentations, it can be reports, it can be a chat room, a lunch, where that's the way they like to communicate, and you have a conversation with them, and that's all they need. Let's move on to the next one. I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about ethics. Ethics is incredibly important in this business. And when I say ethics, I'm generally referring to the ethics that are used in the process of doing primary collection work. My suggestion is for guidelines that you can use to do intelligence work, you can start with the code of ethics that has been developed by Skip over the years. When I served on the board of Skip, we spent approximately half of our year debating the terms and the words that were used in defining this among 15 people who are all considered experts in the field. At the end, our conclusion was we want to leave everything alone and not change a word, because whoever did this before us did a wonderful job. The objective basically was keep it vague. And the reason it's intentionally vague is to encourage you to develop your own policy in your own company in the context of your own corporate culture. And what you'll find when you look at corporate cultures or examples of ethics guidelines that have been prepared by various corporations, the four things that you see below this on the chart usually appear in all of them. In general, public domain material is okay. Proprietary material is not okay. You have to avoid misrepresentation. And the final one, which I think is quite important, is to work with legal not only to develop them, but as a guide when you come across in your work a piece of a project where you're feeling a sort of a knot in your stomach that says, I'm not sure if I should go to the next step. Just stop the work at that time. Go to the legal person, get a review of their case from a legal perspective and how it affects the company, and follow their guidance. If it turns out that they say it's probably best not to do this, then stop the work. If they say it's okay, they'll tell you under what terms, and then you can proceed. And what will happen is, let's say you were asked to do something which had 10 kits associated with it. And because of doing this, there was one of them that you couldn't finish because of the nature of how you had to go about collecting the data or the information. When you present it to your client, if you tell them that, they will understand it and they will respect you for it. They don't need 100% of the answer. 90% is good enough because they get paid big bucks to use their judgment on what's left over. Let's move to the next one. Now we're going to begin to talk about the models. And there are 8 of them. And I'm going to begin with model number 1. And this is a bit unusual because this is the only model of all 8 where there is no professional intelligence person working in the job. Essentially, what's done here is in a company where intelligence is needed, and the management that wants the intelligence puts together an ad hoc group. It could be called a team, it could be called a committee, it could be called a task force. But the concept basically is that it comes together to focus on a discrete single task. And it's not the full-time job of the people to do it. They're called together on this team because they bring an expertise, one of which is listed at the bottom of this page. What you would normally see if there was an intelligence person, a lot of these characteristics that you see with skills and experience on the bottom can be done by one person if they've been in the field for a long time. If people haven't done intelligence work, usually you have to cobble together all of these skills from a group of people to be able to do human source work or to do intelligence analysis or to do a competitive assessment. So that's why this is kind of an ad hoc kind of organization structure. It has pros and cons. Usually you'll get good analytical results out of this. Usually they're very pragmatic because the people who are chosen are people who are internal subject matter experts. It's a time-effective use of resources because the people are being borrowed, and it may actually uncover for you as an intelligence professional, if you're following it, people who are good at this who might want to move into intelligence in their careers. It looks as if the pros are pretty good for a program like this. However, it has some cons as well. It lacks the ability to dig deeply into recommended actions because there isn't a deep way of thinking about how the whole process is working together or putting together the pieces of a puzzle. It doesn't create an institutional memory of what was done. And it cannot be used for early warning kits because those kinds of projects generally require some form of long-term surveillance. And this group is not designed to be a long-term group. So those are some of the pros and cons. Let's try model number 2 and see how model number 2 improves over model number 1. This one is called the process manager. Another term for it is the single person operation. And another one, which is a little bit more affectionate, is called the process manager who is acting as a leader of an orchestra, because that's what he's doing. What's done in this case is one person is hired at a director level. You can see him at the top of the slide. He has intelligence experience. He's done this kind of work either somewhere else or at a lower level. And he is the one who will interact with the decision maker in the defining step of the project. Make sure it's understood, make sure that the 4 Ds will be followed, and then he has no staff to actually do the work for him. So he has access directly to the decision maker. He gets the budget from them, and then he takes the next 3 steps. The secondary research step in library or information services first, followed by human source collection if it becomes necessary, followed by analytical work, and maybe even the use of an ad hoc team as part of the analytical side to bring in some SMEs. And then ultimately, he takes it back because this dissemination stage or the sharing of the findings and conclusions should be presented back to the decision maker by the director. Now, this cycle is the intelligence cycle. You've seen it before, but the way it's used in this particular model basically uses the director as someone who has to get people who don't work for him as direct reports and have him manage the process so that he can deliver on the 4 Ds. What are the downsides of this model? Although the leader of an orchestra idea seems like it's pretty good, some of the weaknesses are that again, you'll have a limited number of projects you can do. This will be usually one project at a time. It's linear. You can't take on multiple projects because you're only one person to manage it. It's weak on early warning because you still can't be doing the kinds of things that require surveillance activity. No institutional memory is created. And often, and this is a sidelight that I learned in person, but I saw it happen, and that was that it turned out that the person they put into this director of intelligence role was not only being evaluated for the quality of his work, but was also being evaluated for his ability to manage people who don't report to him, because they're looking at him as a possible person to move on to another job. So what would happen is there would be a lot of turnover in that director of intelligence program as they were bringing people in they intended to promote into other functions, and new people would constantly come in. That made it a little bit difficult because the good solo directors moved on inside the company, and the ones that didn't get promoted as fast as they'd like would leave the company. So it became kind of, in one case, a developmental position for the person in that job. So if I had to say there's one out of the 8 which is most likely to fail, it's probably this model. And the reason is turnover of the person in the director job. Let's go to model number 3. This one is called the model number 3, 2 minds and a library, or the basic intelligence system. So what you're seeing here, and kind of hidden in these arrows and boxes, if you look carefully, are the 3 basic functions I talked about at the outset. The work will start with the user, who's in the upper left-hand corner. It will go first to the library, which is on the right-hand side. It will go down to the collector, and then it'll go to an analyst, and then it'll come back to the user. So if you kind of put a circle around this, you're seeing the same activities. The difference is that there are now 2 people who are hired to do the function. Usually the people are the collector and the analyst. I'll just take a word to tell you that the reason you're looking at the silhouette of the person on the collector side that looks from the back like a female is because the work that's been done on people to do primary interviewing has shown that, and this is not a biased statement, it's just fact, that women seem to be better collectors than men. They're a little bit more empathetic, they are better listeners, and they usually are able to collect the work better and report back what the collection work was over to the analyst, who's now going to combine with what was collected on the outside with what he did from desk research. Those 2 things are put together, and it's usually then the combination of the analyst and the collector who bring the presentation or the report back to the user. Pros and cons of this one. This has the capability to produce alerts, briefings, reports, assessments. This is better at early warning. It's not the best, but it's better. You can take on monitoring projects. It begins institutionalization because the information can be kept in the library, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you get a similar assignment. But the cons are scarcity of personnel still. You still have only 2 people doing the work, so there are resource limits, and you will get good results from it. And what will happen, and I've seen this happen in a number of cases, is that the word gets around the company, perhaps through word of mouth, that you produce good work, so demand begins to exceed supply. And when that happens, you wind up basically with the whole concept of failure on the basis of having too much to do and not enough resources to do it. The need will develop out of this. It's almost obvious. That's what's missing from this model is a director role, which would become the obvious next step. This would create the ability for someone to organize the projects, to turn down projects when they're inappropriate for this group, to prioritize the work, and to focus it on the highest priority projects, the ones that would be called needle movers by the clients in general. So let's turn to model number 4, and you can see this diagram looks a little bit more complicated, but what you're seeing in model number 4 is essentially the distinction is at the top of this. If you look in the center oval at the top where the 3 arrows are coming out, now we have hired a director. And that director is going to be the one that moves information from information that's coming in from operational divisions, from functional departments, and from operational divisions on the other side out to whoever the customer is. And that could be the business units, could be operations units, or it could be executives. In the shaded area, and this is something that I actually tried in my department, when I got an assignment where it turned out that I just didn't have enough people to be able to do the work properly, I would go back to the person that requested it and ask him, do you have a subject matter expert in this area that you could loan to us for a while? Have him sit in our meetings, have him sit in on our sessions, and add that kind of expertise because we don't have it. And he will usually assign somebody. They will come in as a part-time assignment for them. And then two benefits come out of that. One is you can see that the work will speed up because a lot of the work you'd have to look for is in the head of that person. Usually, this is an insider, obviously. And the second thing is you see a person in action doing intelligence work who doesn't do that for his formal job. And it may turn out that he enjoys doing it more than his formal job. So he winds up coming back to you at some point in the future saying, that trial that I had in your department has given me interest in applying for a position there on a full-time basis. So that's one of the big benefits. So the skills and the staffing to enable quick response that develop offensive action is done best in this model. It's probably the best defense model against what are considered surprises in a tactical sense for your management. And it's the most effective model for early warning, which is mentioned on the bottom of the slide. On the con side, the director has to balance the difference between what is considered strategic work and tactical work. Tactical work is more short-term, strategic work is more long-term. What may happen is a decrease in client satisfaction if the deliverables fall short of expectation, or if demand begins to outstrip supply again because you don't have enough people. I would say that this probably ultimately has somewhere between 3 and 5 full-time professionals in it. Let's go to model number 5.
I'm going to interject for a second, Cliff, because we did have a question come up, and this is probably a best place for it. And it has to do with what we call this. We've been talking about business intelligence, competitive intelligence, and the question really relates to what impact does what we call this have on either the company or the group itself? Does it matter?
That's a matter of opinion. I would say that I've done a survey, I've interviewed 50 of the fellows, and I've asked that question of each of them. And I probably have it split 50-50. It matters. 50 on the other side, it doesn't matter. It depends on whether you come at this from an academic perspective or whether you come at it from a political perspective inside the company, where essentially you're saying, well, gee, this is our turf and this is their turf. And we're different than the business researchers, who are different than the market research, who are different than the strategic planners, who are different than the foresight directors, et cetera. I know there's language issues now. They've always been language issues. One solution is that the word intelligence could be eliminated and replaced with insight everywhere you see it.
Yeah.
Some people like that, other people don't. All I can tell you is whatever the culture is in your company that works, that's the one that's best for you. Okay.
Perfect. Perfect. That's great. Let's keep going. We're about halfway through and getting into some of the real meat of the discussion. So thank you and continue.
Okay. Thank you, Craig. Intelligence department, and the reason I use the word department here is because for the first time of all of the models I've talked about, the term department has been attached to it. And that has a great implication, and it's a term that I think is important in virtually all cultures. And that is, if something is called a department, it gives it a sense of permanence. It gives it a sense of being necessary. For instance, you wouldn't call the marketing function anything but a department, or the finance department a ad hoc group. These are things that are necessary in the view of senior management. And when you get to the point where your department is called the intelligence department, you feel like you've made it, at least to a point where you think you're going to be around a little bit longer. And it usually happens in the medium-sized to larger-sized companies that are multi-divisional and perhaps multinationals. The director reports into senior management. It's highly visible to management with trained intelligence personnel. And it may be that each of these three groups, and again, you're seeing the same three groups: collection, information, and analysis. The difference here is because you have these three functions staffed with a higher number of people in each one, they can specialize in each of the areas that are listed below them. For instance, the intelligence reports would be done by the collection and reporting group. Information services would provide information that comes from online acquisition, managing the files, maintaining electronic databases. This is where the repository of information would reside. Third one, the analysis one, is where the analytical work is done. And this could be on companies, it could be on customers, it could be on industry segments, it could be on what's happening in the political world, in the economic world, in the technology world, anywhere in the competitive landscape. I think it's important to make a distinction here. We're not talking about competitor analysis, we're talking about competitive intelligence analysis. It's not only about competitors, it's about the industry in which you operate. So this is one where it's got a lot of pros. One of the other things is the budgeting in this department usually changes from some of the earlier models where the money is often coming from the client's budget internally in the company to your own budget. It's not all in your own budget, but often it's shared between the person who's commissioning the work and your department, which may have a role in purchasing resources that are used for the whole company in a broader sense. So that's another advantage. On the con side, the leadership has to manage client expectations, keep assignments within scope, and delegate out. One of the things that the head of this kind of a group has to be able to do is when they get a phone call asking for a project to be undertaken, if it turns out they're smart enough to have studied their own company's strengths, they'll know where the strength resides for that work to be done. And if it really doesn't fall within your mission, the smartest thing that director can do is make a recommendation as to where that person should go to have the work done and deflect the work to somewhere else. And you do it politely. You say, look, the people who have the expertise in this are the finance group. Why don't you talk to so-and-so in that group? You'll get your better answers than if you came here. Our expertise is competition and rivalry. When you have something in that area, that's when we want you to come back. So you'll see that that is a role that directors play that is kind of hidden, because a lot of the group projects that are supposed to go elsewhere get done in this department, and people start complaining it's outside the role of my definition of what I'm supposed to be doing. So let me move on now to model number 6. This one, of all of them, is my favorite. It happens to be the one that I worked in at the final stages of my career in intelligence when I was working inside in the corporate world. This is designed for a company that has a very strong central organizational structure. It's generally a global firm, a firm that has centralized decision making where a lot of decisions are forced up rather than down or sideways. Some examples of companies that use this kind of style or have used it in the past include IBM, FedEx, Procter & Gamble, and Merck. The director has excellent access to top management. The central group will run global projects, the one that you see in the circle. The folks that are the spokes of the hub are around the outside, and there is a dotted line relationship between the central group and those outside. For instance, if you looked at international business units on the right-hand side, that would mean intelligence people who are full-time but are working in a subsidiary. For instance, someone in Merck France or Merck Japan, something like that, who does intelligence work there. That person is connected to the central unit, but most of the time that's a weak connection because the person is reporting into the head of his country. The people in the center are reporting into the head of the global organization. For corporate staff functions, as an example on the other side, something like public relations, something like market research, something like legal, something like finance, who are also customers of a CI group, they are reporting into the senior management team, but they generally have the kinds of projects that you can help them with by walking down the hall and chatting with them. They don't generally have really deep kinds of questions. Domestic business units, the example I can give here is that the US operation we had at Merck was almost as large as the one we had in headquarters. They were able to stand on their own. I didn't hear too much from them unless I needed to learn something from something they did. So there was exchange that went in both directions, but it wasn't mandatory. For example, the size of people that could be in this, I can tell you that in the business unit that I ran, started out with 2 people when I first joined the company, and 16 years later, there were 35 people. And they all grew as a result of demand exceeding supply as we extended our work into a variety of specific areas. Now, let me move on to number 7. And this happens to be the model I like the least. It's called the Business Intelligence Matrix. But again, it's designed by the corporate culture of a firm which is large, it's global, but it's highly decentralized in decision-making style. And each unit of the company may be in a completely different business. This is a company that has a variety of businesses which are not connected to one another in any way. Examples of this that have actually occurred are Kodak, which is gone, Baxter, which is merged, Dow, which is merged, and Pfizer, which is somebody that you probably know because you've heard about them in developing the COVID vaccine. But I can tell you that this style is about as opposite from the hub and spoke that you can consider. And what really comes up in my view for it is the pros are that it's good for the individual who's working in the group because he has a limited scope of what he has to become an expert in. Only his area of the company. There is a community of practice among all of these folks that get together, but it isn't mandatory. And it's good to support that unit strategy and tactics, but not to support the entire company. The group in the middle, the strategic intelligence function, may either be small or may not exist at all. The best example I can give you of that in my industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, is Johnson & Johnson, which had 225 separate business units, each one of which had an intelligence function in it and no central intelligence operation until 2 years ago when they first put it in. So there are models which are successful. I mean, a company like Merck is successful, a company like J&J is successful, but they work in a culture that is completely different than the other one. And that's the reason why when you choose the model that you want to use, it has to stay within the way management decisions are made. The final model, which is number 8, and we can go on to the next slide, is called the intelligence community design. This is the one that Jan Herring operated in when he worked for Motorola. That was his first job working on the private side. Other companies that use this model include General Dynamics and Phillips Petroleum. This is a full service intelligence operation inside a very large multinational company. All 3 services are available at the top level. You see the first bar inside the box for intelligence users at the corporate level, and they have all 3 elements: analysis, information systems, and collection, and they are funded fully on their own. You can see they list 3 others below them, which are divisional level groups that also have their own separate functions that they can control, and they will work in the service of functional departments, operational divisions of one type or another. This is actually a structure that supports an intelligence culture in the company. It's well respected. It's been around usually for a long time. One of the things this one does that some of the others don't is it allows for people development in the intelligence field. There are usually a number of job levels that are created in each one of these areas where people can be promoted within the intelligence function to higher and higher levels of responsibility so that they wind up having direct reports and having people that work for them, and they begin to delegate. What comes out of this is 2 types of people, what I like to call pillars and movers. The pillars are the ones who say, I love this kind of work. I want to make it a career. So I'm going to try to stay and ultimately work my way up into the corporate group where I'm serving senior management all the time. The movers are the ones who come in and say, this is a good stop along the way. I get to meet customers in certain areas of the company where I really want to go. So after a couple of years or so, I would like to say, now I know a lot about marketing, or I know a lot about business development, or I know a lot about licensing. That's where I want to go, and let's see if we can move me on. So both of those types of people can get corporate to help them have their careers move along, which is a big benefit of this for the people who work in it. On the con side, this one will have the highest overall CI budget in the company. And sometimes that is viewed by other departments, which see them or would like to paint them as a cost center rather than a value producing center. And it also may make some of the people in the corporate group elitist. They'd be thinking that they are better than others because they have access to the CEO and his direct reports all the time, and nobody else does. But I can tell you that that doesn't last very long because there's an awful lot of turnover even at the CEO level. Churn occurs at these senior levels, so you're only as good as the work you can do for your current senior manager. I'm going to stop here and see if there are other questions before I move on. Craig, do you have any others you'd like to ask?
Not specifically around the models. This was very good. There was a question, and it kind of harkens back to last month's webinar that the CI fellows did about AI. And is AI going to replace us? I know we've talked about this ad nauseum, but your perspective and your thoughts on, is AI going to change materially what you've been talking about here?
Uh, I'm so glad you asked. Um, it happens that I have a slide coming up where I will address that question. And if you
Perfect.
have 1 or 2 minutes patience, I'll get to it. Okay?
Yeah, no, we're
I'll
doing
come right
well.
back to it.
We will
Uh,
move to the next section and let you keep at it. You're doing well. Thank you,
okay.
sir.
The next section is about the decision as to where this function belongs in the company. And there is a selection of a model that's made, which has to be unique to every company and its culture. And you probably have all heard the phrase culture eats strategy. I believe in that 100%. You can write strategy as long as you want, but if you have culture that won't change, you can write strategy and it'll become a book on the shelf that gathers dust. And you can do it every 3 years and it'll gather more dust. So, most important thing to pay attention to is the culture. If the model is aligned with the corporate operation, intelligence will improve its effectiveness and it will have a much longer term viability as a necessary and needed function. I'd like to refer you in this to 3 studies that were conducted by Skip. The time goes back on this somewhat, but it's the trend I wanted to point out to you. In the 1980s, the first study of this question was done by Skip. And what they went to was a large number of folks that were working in intelligence that were members of the organization. And the data that came back showed that 40% of the intelligence groups were located in a strategy function, 30% were located in a market research function, and the rest were mixed. They repeated the study in the 1990s. What they found there was that 30% were in the strategy function, 40% were in market research, and now, for the first time, 10% were independent. And that's the reason you see this chart on this page. What you're looking at here is an ideal structure, a kind of a dream structure for all of the groups that provide some form of decision support to the top management team and the CEO. And you see business intelligence listed as one of them. What we're saying in that study is that 10% of the firms had the business intelligence people move to that level, where they were equal to a strategy group or equal to a business intelligence group, uh, but not yet at the level that some of the others had there because they had been there for a much longer time. Then they did the last one that is still on record, and that's the one that was done in the 2000s. And this was the most remarkable change. It resulted in 10% of them being in strategy groups, 22% in market research still, but 32% for the first time were independent. They had come up to the level where they reported into, let's say, a vice president or an executive vice president who was the direct boss who reported ultimately into the C suite, or they would be part of the C suite that they were reporting to. So the chart is just designed to illustrate the trend towards becoming independence and the proof of value by being moved up in large corporations where they're closer and closer to the top. Those of you who have had training or worked in intelligence work in the military will wonder why this wasn't the way it was from the beginning. Because in military, the intelligence group starts at this location. They don't have to fight their way up. They're usually at the right hand of the general in giving him advice on whether to attack or not to attack or how to attack, etc. And when they move over to the private side, they have to start at the bottom and move up. And that's a little bit difficult, which is why a lot of people who start in military intelligence try to make it in private and they don't succeed. Let's move on to the next slide. Selecting the model. And here we're going to have some advice about which ones fit into what type of cultures. So you need to think about the culture of your company as I go through them. Imagine there was an arrow on the left side of this chart, going from the bottom towards the top. And what you're measuring is time and the maturity of the function. You're also probably also measuring the number of personnel and the resources and the independence level associated with budgeting. So we start at the bottom. The business intelligence or CI process manager, the single person model. The key to this is selecting the right director, somebody that can stay a little longer than most people. It does have the greatest chance of failure. My suggestion is in order for it to survive more than a year, it must produce something seen by senior management as a needle mover. And they'll know what needle movers are. They'll think it in terms of opportunity cost. They'll think of it in terms of market share. They'll think in terms of it in all the measurements that are used to discuss and measure value for a function. Then you move up to the middle group, which are cost conscious and conservative managements. This is usually in medium to large firms, growing companies, a lot of management churn. This is middle management who themselves, the clients, are being moved from one job to another. This requires people which have flexibility, adaptability, and a little bit more personnel than you saw in the earlier one. Intelligence Center, the Matrix organization, and Two Minds in a Library usually fit in this group well. The top one, which is formal and disciplined cultures. This is what I would call traditional organization structure with management operations and procedures that established over many years, hardly ever change. The goal changes to longevity. How long will you keep the function going? How long will you continue to produce good outcomes and bring along new people who can be moved through the company, perhaps into other areas, or if they decide to stay and make professionals careers in intelligence work. The models that fit here are the intelligence department, the hub and spoke model, and the corporate intelligence community. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is the one where I'm going to come back to the question about AI if you have your patience. I'll get to it in a moment.
Absolutely. In fact, I want to add to that because I know it's kind of built into this. Over my career in CI, I've seen uh, facts and figures that say that most CI groups don't survive more than about 3 years, except for the exceptions. So, in fighting for the resources and how companies reorganize endlessly, is there any strategy or any way that CI groups can last? And I'm sure it's built into some of these questions. So please let us know.
Well, yeah, I'll cover it when I cover the questions because it's apparent that you have. Well, the one thing that's I guess is absolutely essential is to have a champion who will hang around a little bit longer than most champions do. A lot of people who are champions come for a while and then they leave, or they're reorganized, or they don't
Yeah.
succeed. So if you have somebody at the top who believes that your work is necessary and the work you have done for them has actually met the expectations they set when you set out on the work itself, that really is what does it. It's the work speaking for itself rather than, nudging the people constantly to keep me around and give me more money, etc. That will come if the work actually speaks for itself. Now let me turn
Excellent.
to these questions that are on this page. These four are the single most common questions that have been asked when I've presented this material before, many times in other places. The first one: do different industries require different types of CI organizations? In one word, the answer is no. The models work across industries, and what's important far more than the industry is the culture and the management style being more important and that you're aligned with them. For example, the hub and spoke, which is the one that I was most familiar with, is used in electronics, it's used in pharma, it's used in consumer packaged goods, and in others. And it works well in many very successful companies that operate using that model. Number two, do service and manufacturing firms require different types of CI organizations? Again, the answer is not generally. Properly selected models will work in both. One possible distinction might be that firms which have short-term business cycles, in those kinds of firms, more tactical skills are needed, such as field collection and reporting. Often the management is driven, particularly publicly held companies in the United States, are often held to task by Wall Street to provide reports every 3 months that are perfect or look great. So what is always done there is focusing on how do I get to the next quarter and how do I do it with positive news. So a lot of your tasks become shorter and focused on living for another 3 months. The intelligence work that's done in other companies, which have much more longer term business cycles, and examples here would be the aerospace industry or the pharma industry that I'm familiar with, may be better because they require greater analytical depth, greater technical strength, and they often get involved in forecasting. And the forecasting goes beyond a year. Often it's forecasting that will go out to a 5-year window, or maybe even longer than that. And that it could be qualitative kind of forecasting or even quantitative kind of forecasting. So when you're working on projects that have a longer term horizon, that's where I think perhaps there's different types of organizations. It's not so much the different types of models, it's different types of people with different sets of skills. Number three, which types of business activities do require particular organizational models? And here there's two very clear answers. The first one is R&D units. People who are doing research and development with long-term developmental pipelines require highly technical skills like science, like engineering, particularly when you have firms where they're developing intellectual property which leads to protection, such as patents or trademarks or other forms of ways where your inventions are key to having your company become successful. That will require a different kind of people. That will be also managed a little bit differently. The finance function, on the other hand, has a different kind of need with regard to the model. And again, it's the kind of activity. The finance function really requires very little primary intelligence collection. Their work is probably mostly all secondary. What they do require is superior IT support, which helps them acquire, manage, and analyze large volumes of quantitative data and report it absolutely accurately and precisely, because they are the ones accountable for producing the numbers that are shared publicly in a publicly held firm. Number four, and this is where we get at the question about AI. Do new business models such as the cyber economy or virtual firms require totally new organization models? Ones I haven't discussed, look, I'm living in the past and I haven't caught up with what's going on. Well, I can tell you that AI is not new, it's just louder. It's been around for a long time. And I can tell you that yes, the answer to this question is yes. And some of the ones that are actually have been working inside these kinds of firms are already working in a virtual way. This was accelerated by COVID with people working at home. And now the mix that we have between some home time people and some office time people and the connections that occur based on people that are geographically dispersed requires a different way of communicating. It requires a different way of operating. And that way of operating may include, as part of it, the use of AI technology that everybody shares. which may change the nature of the activities that you will be doing, perhaps on the collection side more than I would say on the analytical side, at least at the outset. Now, I think it's not so much whether you think it's worth using, it's whether your clients think it's worth using. Because if they see output that comes from a AI produced report that has a lot of problems associated with it, they'll come back to you and say, gee, I'd really like to use a human brain for this until the AI gets worked out. So we're just at the beginning. My comment will be that yes, your work will change. The amount of time you spend on the gathering of information can be reduced, which allows for a greater amount of time to be devoted to analytical work, thinking, which is what you're really paid to do, critical strategic thinking skills, and coming up with alternatives for your management to think about with regard to actions that they need to take to be successful. I think we're still at the beginning of the AI change. It's going to last a long time. It's going to make everything in our lives different. And if I was able to predict where it's going to go, I wouldn't need to do this for a job. It's going to be around for a very long time, and I think we have to wait and see how it develops. Now, I'm going to go in the last couple of sections to something that we don't usually talk about in these meetings, but I want to because I think it's important to be pragmatic. Let's move on to the next slide, which is called Developing the CI Program Budget. Now here, what happens with budget planning is that the final selection of the model may be limited to something very practical, which is how much money is available to get you started if you don't have a department at all, and how much money is someone willing to give you to get started if you don't have one at all. And what will be your independence level? In other words, will your budget be funded by your clients at the outset, or will you hold it yourself? Usually the plan is that clients fund it at the beginning. As you grow, you begin to split it with them. And as you get larger, you begin to take greater control, which allows you to ultimately get to the point where you may achieve complete internal budget control. That's kind of a dream state. It doesn't always happen that way, but that might be a way of thinking about where you'd like to be. Based on this whole process is based on the objective setting process of your company. There is a cycle to do that. It may be annual, it may be biannual, but the key is to have your director, whoever actually represents you, when your programs and ideas for new personnel and new services that you want to offer, or additional kinds of things you'd like to add, are presented in the context of other departments where you are competing for resources. And that usually happens. Sometimes you get what you ask for, sometimes you don't. It will depend. And what happens normally is after you've done this for a while, some things will automatically be renewed, particular subscriptions to certain data sources that are considered absolutely necessary to be able to conduct the work. And it isn't just used by you, it's used by other people in the company as well. And perhaps the part that I've left out of this analysis that I'm going to show you on the next slide is the top item in the box, personnel and management. I've not included any example numbers for that because this is where salaries are, this is where raises are, this is where benefits are, this is where all of the things that have to do with people are. And I didn't want to take any risk in putting any numbers in here at all because it's so different in every company. But these are the categories where the money should go. Now, I'm going to show you a chart on the next slide, which is an actual example of money that is spent in a group which is mid-sized, let's say a 3 to 5 full-time equivalent group. Information services, between $100,000 and $300,000. And then you can look down the whole list to see when you're planning this out, it's coming from what came out of the discussions you had at the beginning of the year with your clients about projects you plan to do over the course of that planning cycle, how you plan to do them, and what tools you're going to need them to do them. If you have them now, if you have to buy them, you have to spend money on the outside. The last thing, which is called special operations, I've left that out. And I don't know if I have enough time to even mention this, but I will. There is a case that happened to me at Merck, which I have to relate because I never forget it. I had been working there about 4 years, and I got a call directly from the CEO on a project which was not in the budget. And it was one that would take a lot of money to do. After we discussed the content, I said to him, Sir, I'd like to be able to say that I have funding to do this, but we didn't plan for it. And he just responded with one word. He said, oops, and he hung up the phone. And I had no idea what that meant. So what did I do? I went around to my friends and I said, what does oops mean when it comes out of the CEO's name? And he said, well, in this company, oops stands for the letters OOPS, which means Office of the President Services. And what he told me was the company was smart enough to anticipate that when they did their budgeting, they only budgeted for 95% of what they expected to spend on specific projects each year. 5% was held back, knowing that over the course of the year, these special projects would come up. They couldn't predict them in advance. They couldn't predict which department would need them. But the CEO was the only one who had the right to dip into it and say, send the bill here. So the motto of the end of the story is look around in your company to see if you can find an oops budget, because probably it exists if you can find it. Last part of the program, and then we're going to wrap it up. I haven't talked much about outsourcing strategy, but I want to close on that because I know a lot of the people listening on the phone are working for agencies as opposed to working for people who are inside CI people, practitioners. I think it's actually important for you to think about their role and their relationship with the company and how the company makes decisions whether to use you or not to use you. And that is important. So if you look at this slide, you take a look down to the first bullet. You want to use professionally vetted external expertise in primary research projects and third-party collection where you can't do it yourself. That's primarily the place you think about it. It could be at a convention. It could be primary interviewing where they have a network of experts in the field, but they have to be vetted. And what do I mean by vetted? Qualifications, references, previous legal cases from ethics, perhaps. Are they a generalist or are they a specific company that knows only works in your industry? They have to act as an extension of your staff. And if they're out on the road doing work for you, they must follow your own internal ethical guidelines. They're almost working as an extension of your staff. And the last question I always ask them is, are you clear of conflicts? And what that means is the following. If I call someone up at an agency and I say, I need you to do a CI set of interviews for me in the field of antibiotics, and I ask, have you been working in antibiotics for anybody else over the past year or two? And these are people I know because I've worked with them for in some other areas. And they respond by saying, yes, I work for one of your competitors in that area, and it was recent. My response is, thank you for being honest. We'll pass on this one, and I'll come back to you when you don't have a conflict. I think that's important, and it goes on. And if you're an agency and you hear that, it's the appropriate thing to do. Okay? So we're going to close on the final slide, which is what I call outsourcing possibilities. And this looks a lot like the slide you saw at the beginning. The only difference, basically, is that the director, and this I'm using the example of the solar practitioner, when he goes to the 3 steps in between, what the outsourcing work that has to be done. He has two choices. He can do it internally or he can do it externally. And in each case, he has to make the decision, do I have enough resources inside without having to go outside? That's where I should stay. Particularly if the project involves something that's highly confidential or something that you can't share outside the firm. Or on the other hand, if the person on the outside has much more expertise or much more expertise than you have on the inside, it's better to go with the outside person. At the end, there's the question of when the work is done and the work comes in, who presents the work to the final person who is actually going to receive the findings. My view is it should be the person who commissioned the study on the inside. That person knows a lot more about what the questions were that were asked. If there was anything that confidential that couldn't have been shared with the agency, he can talk about it publicly. He can't talk about it when the agency is in the room. If it turns out there's nothing confidential, sometimes the outside agency person will come and present part of it or sit in the room to clarify, because they may have been the ones that have conducted the interviews and they can add color. So that kind of wraps up what I have to say. I think I'm a little bit over time, but I hope you consider this presentation worth it. Thank you for listening, and I hope you walk away with a couple pearls.
Thank you, Cliff. Yes, absolutely. This has been very, very informative and a lot of good tidbits that you provided. I'll draw the audience's attention to the fact that this full article is not only at the Competitive Intelligence Magazine site from a few years ago, but also available under publications at the Council of Competitive Fellows website. And there's a link in the slides if you access those from the website as well. So I will again thank you, Cliff. And on the next slide, I'll highlight the fact that the next month in May, we're going to be talking about scenario planning. And the key question there was, why bother with scenario planning? And there's some very good reasons why you may want to. In fact, that deer in the headlights of your car shown there in that graph has a number of potential outcomes, only one of which may be what you're really looking for. So we're going to be looking at those questions, and hope that you'll join us on May 16th at 11 Eastern or 3 a.m. Or 3 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and we'll dive into the scenario planning questions then. Thank you, and have a great day.